It was a calm neighborhood where most people liked to mind their own business. The street looked peaceful from the outside, with trimmed lawns, parked cars, and kids riding bicycles in the evenings. But inside that peace, there were moments when tension quietly moved from house to house, especially whenever the local HOA got involved. They were known for being strict, sometimes even too strict. But for many residents, it was easier to follow the rules than argue. Most people avoided trouble, paid any fines they got, and went back to their routine. The homeowner in this story had moved into the neighborhood only a few months earlier. He was a simple person, someone who worked hard, kept his home clean, and tried not to disturb anyone. He liked his quiet afternoons and his evenings spent on the porch with a cup of tea. For him, this new house felt like a fresh start. He didn't know much about the HOA when he moved in. He only heard that they looked after the community, handled maintenance, and kept everything organized. He trusted that things would be fine. The first few weeks passed with no issues. He greeted neighbors, waved at kids who played outside, and enjoyed the fresh air in the mornings. But everything changed the day he found a letter taped to his door. It was from the HOA. At first, he thought it must be something general, maybe a notice for everyone. When he opened it, he realized it was addressed only to him. The letter said his grass was 2 inches too long and needed to be cut immediately, or he would face a fine. He looked at his lawn and felt confused. It looked normal, not overgrown or neglected. The neighbor across the street even complimented it a few days earlier. He didn't think much of it. He mowed the grass again just to be safe. He assumed maybe someone from the HOA had a strict measuring style. He brushed it off. But then, another letter came the week after. This time, the HOA claimed his mailbox color did not match the approved shade for the community. The strange thing was, his mailbox had been there long before he moved in. The previous owners used it for years without a problem. When he asked a neighbor if the HOA ever complained about this mailbox before, the neighbor shook his head and said, "Never." He felt something was off, but once again, he didn't want to argue. He repainted the mailbox. He just wanted peace, but the letters kept coming. Another letter accused him of leaving a trash bin visible for more than allowable minutes. Another claimed he had a non-approved plant in his front yard. Another said his car was parked slightly too forward, even though it was fully inside his driveway. Every week there was a new complaint, a new problem, a new threat of fines. At this point, he began noticing something strange. The complaints were always vague, always exaggerated, and always directed at him alone. Other homes around him had small things out of place too: a trash bin left out overnight, a lawn not cut for a few extra days, a car parked at an angle but no one else received letters like he did. A few neighbors quietly told him, "They're tough on new people. They want to test you," another neighbor added. "Some board members like to show they're in control. If you don't respond the way they want, things get worse." He didn't like the sound of that. It felt unfair, almost targeted. But he still tried to stay calm. He didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. Every time a letter came, he tried to fix the issue. He trusted that if he cooperated, the pressure would stop. But it didn't. Soon the letters turned into warnings. The wording became sharper. They started saying things like, "Failure to comply will result in further action, and your continued neglect of community standards is unacceptable." Reading these messages made him feel uneasy. He lived alone most days, and this constant communication from the HOA made the house feel heavier. He wondered if anyone else had gone through something like this. One evening, he sat on the porch thinking about all the letters he had received in such a short time. The sun was setting, and the street looked peaceful, but he didn't feel peaceful at all. That's when an older neighbor approached him. She had lived there for many years. She pulled up a chair, sat beside him, and said quietly, "You're not the first one they've done this to." Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. She explained that the HOA's board had changed recently. A few new members took over and wanted everyone to follow their rules without question. Anyone who pushed back or even asked for details got labeled as a problem. Some residents just paid fines to avoid trouble. Some complained once but then gave up because nothing changed. Then she said something that stuck with him. They want people to feel intimidated. They think fear keeps things in order. That didn't sit well with him. Fear was no way to manage a neighborhood, and he wasn't someone who backed down easily. He had gone through tougher things in life. A few letters shouldn't break him. Still, he didn't want conflict. He simply wanted fairness, so the next time he got a letter, instead of rushing to fix the so-called issue, he wrote a polite message back. He asked the HOA to show the exact rule he had violated and to explain how they measured it. He also requested photos or evidence. The tone of his message was calm and respectful. Days passed with no reply. Then, without warning, he received a letter that sounded much more aggressive. It claimed he was ignoring official notices and failing to cooperate with community leadership. The letter ended with a line that felt more like a threat than a rule. If you continue this pattern, the HOA will take further steps. He knew he had not ignored anything. He had simply asked for clarity. That's when he realized the HOA didn't want clarity. They didn't want discussion. They wanted obedience. Things escalated when 2 HOA board members came to his house unannounced one afternoon. They knocked on his door and stood there with clipped expressions as if they were the final authority in the neighborhood. They repeated the same accusations he had already read in the letters. When he tried to ask questions, one of them raised a hand and cut him off, saying, "We expect compliance, not argument." Their tone was firm, almost dismissive. It felt like they were not there for a conversation. They were there to show power. After they left, he stood in his doorway for a moment, confused and frustrated. The street looked normal, but everything around him felt different now. He had never dealt with something like this before. He wondered why they were so determined to target him. In the following days, neighbors started noticing the tension. Some would give him sympathetic looks. Others quietly warned him that certain HOA board members liked to push new residents until they behaved. Heard stories that some people had even moved out because of the pressure. He didn't want that to happen to him. He had bought this house because he wanted a stable place to live. He wasn't ready to give that up just because a few people wanted to show control. One morning, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and decided he wouldn't let the situation scare him. He would stand his ground, but he would do it respectfully. He wasn't interested in fighting. He was interested in fairness and answers. And even though he didn't know it yet, this small decision to push back politely would soon uncover something much bigger. Something the HOA didn't expect anyone to question. Something that would change everything on that quiet street. Because while he was thinking about how to respond, the HOA board members were thinking about how to deal with him permanently. They didn't like being challenged. They didn't like being questioned. And they were about to make a decision that would reveal just how far they were willing to go to keep their power. But what they didn't know was that the house they were targeting wasn't as ordinary as they thought. Someone connected to that home knew the truth about authority, fairness, and real rules. Someone who, without any grand introduction, would soon become the key reason this entire story took a dramatic turn. And while the HOA planned their next move, the neighborhood continued to look peaceful on the surface, quiet lawns, friendly waves, and warm evenings. But just beneath that calmness, a storm was forming. One that would expose everything the HOA had been. Hiding this was only the beginning of what would soon become one of the most unbelievable events the neighborhood had ever emerged. Witness the days after the last HOA visit felt heavier than before. The homeowner tried to continue his normal routine, but every time he looked at his mailbox or his yard, he remembered the tone the board members used when they spoke to him. It wasn't the tone of people trying to help. It was the tone of people who believed they had full control. Still, he didn't want to live with fear or frustration. He wanted clarity. He wanted fairness. So he wrote another message to the HOA, this time even more detailed and polite. He explained that he wasn't refusing anything. He simply wanted proper information so he could understand the rules better. He ended the message with a simple line, "Please help me understand what exactly needs to be corrected so I can follow the community guidelines properly." He thought this would calm things down. A respectful message should lead to a respectful reply. That's how normal communication works. But with the HOA, nothing seemed normal. Instead of answers, he received another letter 2 days later. This one didn't have any explanation. It simply said he had failed to meet compliance expectations, and that the HOA board would be taking the next step. He read that line twice. The next step? What did that even mean? Why couldn't they just explain the issue properly? Why were they acting like something much bigger was going on? He put the letter down and tried to stay calm, but a small knot of worry sat in his chest. That evening, he went for a walk around the neighborhood to clear his mind. Families were out. Kids rode bikes. Someone was grilling in their backyard. Everything looked so normal. But as he walked past the community office building, where the HOA occasionally gathered, he noticed something strange. The lights were on, even though it was past their usual hours. Curious, he slowed down. Through the half-closed blinds, he could see silhouettes moving inside. It looked like a group meeting. He wasn't trying to spy, but something in him paused. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw one person slam a folder on the table. Another pointed at something on the wall, maybe a document or a photo. Their gestures seemed intense, not like a casual conversation. A small uneasiness crept into him. He continued walking, trying to push the thought aside. The next morning, he woke up to another unexpected sight. A white SUV he had never seen before was parked across the street. A man inside was sitting with sunglasses on, holding a clipboard, staring toward his house. When the homeowner stepped outside to grab his morning mail, the man looked away quickly, pretending to study the paper on his clipboard. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was overthinking. So he didn't say anything. He simply walked back inside and tried to forget about it. But later that afternoon, another neighbor mentioned something odd. "I saw 2 HOA board members talking to a guy in that SUV earlier," she said. "They were pointing toward your house." The homeowner felt his stomach sink a little. Why was the HOA talking to someone about him? And who was this man with a clipboard sitting outside for hours? That same day, he received yet another letter. This one was different. It didn't start with notice or fine. The letter said he had violated community cooperation standards, which was something he had never heard of before. Then it added a line that made the situation feel even more serious. Failure to cooperate may lead to involvement of further authorities. He stared at that line for a long time. What authorities? Why were they speaking like this? And why did the situation suddenly feel so personal? He knew he had asked for clarity, not fought with them. He had never refused to fix anything. But it seemed like the more he tried to understand, the more the HOA escalated things. That night, he visited the older neighbor who had warned him earlier. She listened quietly as he explained everything that had happened in the past few days. Her face grew more serious with each detail. When he finished talking, she sighed. "This isn't normal," she said softly. "I think certain people in the HOA are pushing this too far. They don't like being questioned. They've done things before that were unfair, but this seems more extreme than anything I've heard." He asked her if anyone ever called outside people to pressure a resident. She paused before answering. There were rumors once. A few years back, someone said the HOA tried to bring in a private security person to scare a resident about a fence issue. But nothing like that was ever proven. And after that, people became too scared to talk. Hearing that didn't comfort him. It only raised more questions. Why would an HOA try to intimidate residents? What did they gain from it? Was it personal? Or was it simply about showing power? The next morning was quiet. The white SUV was gone. For a moment he thought maybe the situation was calming down. Maybe the HOA had realized they were being unreasonable, but that peace only lasted a few hours. In the afternoon, he stepped outside to trim a few plants in his yard. While he worked, he heard footsteps approaching. When he looked up, 2 HOA board members were walking toward him again. Their expressions looked stiff, like they were already annoyed. One of them spoke first. "We're here because you still haven't followed the necessary steps." He tried to stay calm and asked, "Can you please explain what exactly I haven't followed? I've asked for clear details. I want to fix whatever is wrong." Instead of answering, one of the board members gave a half smile and said, "We've already told you. You are making things harder for yourself by asking too many questions." The other added, "This community works smoothly when people don't challenge the system. If you simply did what we asked, this wouldn't be an issue." Their words felt strange. He wasn't refusing anything. He only wanted clarity. Why did they make it sound like he was the problem for wanting information? He said calmly, "I'm only asking for proper rules so I don't make a mistake." Isn't that reasonable? Their expressions tightened. They exchanged a look, as if silently agreeing on something. Then one of them said something that made the homeowner pause. "If you keep pushing like this, we'll have to take things to another level," he asked. "What does that mean?" But they didn't explain. They simply turned around and walked away. He watched them leave, feeling a strange chill. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was the realization that something unusual was happening. This wasn't about rules anymore. This wasn't about grass or mailboxes or plants. This felt like something personal, something planned. Later that week, a neighbor sent him a message. The message said, "I overheard something at the community office. I think the HOA is planning something big. Be careful." His heart thumped a little faster. He replied asking what the neighbor heard, but the neighbor only said he didn't catch everything. Just that the board mentioned handling the situation more aggressively and making an example. Making an example? That wasn't something an HOA should say. This sounded like a group that believed they had more power than they actually did. That evening, he sat quietly in his living room, thinking about everything that had happened in the past few weeks. It didn't make sense. Why would a simple request for clarity cause this much tension? Why did the HOA seem so desperate to prove something? As he sat there, he remembered the older neighbor's words. They think fear keeps things in order. Maybe that was it. Maybe the HOA board wanted to show everyone that questioning them wasn't allowed. Maybe they believed that by going after him, it could scare the rest of the community into silence. But the HOA didn't know him well. They didn't know he wasn't someone who gave in to pressure easily. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he also wasn't someone who would be pushed around without reason. Still, he didn't know just how far the HOA was willing to go. Not yet. Because at the same time, he sat quietly trying to understand their behavior inside the HOA meeting room. The board members were discussing an idea they had never dared to try before. They believed they had tried everything. Letters hadn't scared him. Warnings hadn't scared him. Unannounced visits hadn't scared him. So now they wanted to try something much bolder. Something that would make him panic. Something that would force him into obedience. They talked about pressure. They talked about intimidation. Then one of them brought up a plan involving a private security person they knew, someone willing to act official if needed. It was a plan that was reckless, unfair, and completely out of line. And while they whispered their plan behind closed doors, they had no idea that the person they were targeting lived in a house that carried a quiet connection. A connection they knew nothing about. A connection that would soon turn everything upside down. The HOA thought they had power, but they were about to learn what real authority looked like, and they were about to make the worst mistake they could possibly make, one that would shock the whole neighborhood. The morning of the incident started like any other. The homeowner woke up, made himself breakfast, and tried not to think too much about the HOA's behavior. He kept reminding himself that maybe things would calm down. Maybe the HOA board would finally send proper answers. Maybe he was worrying too much. But deep down, he knew something was off. He could feel it. Sometimes your mind ignores trouble, but your instinct doesn't. And that day, his instinct felt unusually alert. The air outside was quiet. A soft breeze moved the leaves. Everything looked calm, almost too calm. After breakfast, he stepped outside to water a few plants near his porch. He tried focusing on small, simple things to keep his thoughts clear. About an hour later, he noticed a dark-colored vehicle driving slowly down the street. It wasn't a car he recognized. It wasn't the white SUV from earlier. This one looked different. The windows were tinted, and it moved at a steady, suspicious pace. He watched as it passed, but it didn't stop. Still, something about it didn't feel right. He went back inside and tried to continue his day. He cleaned a bit, checked some emails, and made a cup of tea. But just as he sat down, he heard a loud knock at his door. Not a regular knock. It was sharp, forceful, the kind of knock that made your heart beat faster. He stood up, walked slowly to the door, and looked through the peephole. A man was standing on his porch. The man wore a dark uniform that looked somewhat official, but also slightly off. The badge didn't look like a real law enforcement badge. The belt had equipment, but not the right kind. The uniform didn't match any department he knew. His instincts spoke immediately. Something isn't right. The man knocked again, louder this time. When the homeowner finally opened the door just a few inches, the man stepped forward as if trying to push his way in with authority. "Are you aware of the violation notice issued to you?" the man said. His voice was firm, but his attitude felt too aggressive, too eager. The homeowner kept the door halfway closed and said calmly, "Who are you exactly?" The man straightened his shoulders and replied, "I'm here to take action. The HOA has requested cooperation after multiple warnings. You need to come with me for questioning." The words didn't make sense. Questioning. The homeowner repeated, surprised. "By who? And for what?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Step outside. I don't want to make this more difficult." The homeowner looked at the man's uniform again. The badge didn't show a department name. The patches were blank. The tone felt rehearsed, not natural. "Are you a police officer?" the homeowner asked. The man paused for a second, 1 second too long. "I'm authorized," he said, avoiding the question. "Authorized by who?" "The HOA." The homeowner didn't move. "If you're a real officer, show me your ID or badge number." The man's expression tightened. He repeated, more aggressively, "Step outside now." "No," the homeowner replied firmly. Just then, a neighbor walking a dog across the street stopped and stared. She recognized the man instantly, not as a police officer, but as someone who once worked as security for a local event center. He was not law enforcement. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said aloud. The man on the porch glanced at her. For a moment, a flicker of panic crossed his face, but instead of leaving, he doubled down. He spoke louder, trying to sound official. "You are resisting an order. I will detain you if I have to." The homeowner narrowed his eyes. "Detain me for what? You haven't told me who you are or what authority you think you have." The man stepped forward again, his hand reaching out as if he was ready to grab the homeowner's arm. Before he could touch anything, a voice from inside the house called out, a strong, confident voice, a voice that didn't belong to just anyone. "Hey, step back from that door." The fake officer turned. His expression changed instantly when he saw who was standing there. The man inside wasn't dressed like a police officer at the moment. He was in casual clothes, but his posture, his tone, his presence carried real authority. He wasn't an ordinary visitor. He was the city's police chief. He had come earlier that morning to drop something off and had stayed to chat for a bit. And now he stood a few feet behind the homeowner, staring at the fake officer with eyes that could cut through lies. "Who are you?" the police chief asked sternly. The fake officer swallowed. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. They said there was a stop talking," the police chief said sharply. "And show me your identification." The man froze. He didn't move. "He didn't speak ID," the police chief repeated. "Now," the fake officer started to stutter. I don't have it on me." "But the HOA, there's no situation where an HOA can send someone to perform a detention," the police chief said. "What you're doing is impersonating an officer." Tension exploded. Within seconds, the police chief stepped outside, pulling the homeowner safely behind him. The neighbor across the street was still on the phone with the real emergency line. Other neighbors had come out of their homes, watching with wide eyes. Just then, another car turned the corner. A real police car. Lights flashing, too. Officers stepped out immediately. The fake officer looked around. Realizing the situation was collapsing fast, he tried to back away, but it was too late. The police chief pointed at him. "Detain him. He's impersonating law enforcement." The man didn't even try to resist. Officers grabbed his hands, placed them behind his back, and secured him while he muttered excuses. "It was just a misunderstanding. The HOA told me to." Didn't mean, but no explanation could help him now. The homeowner stood on the porch, still processing what had just happened. It didn't feel real. One moment he was watering plants. The next moment, someone pretending to be from law enforcement was trying to drag him out of his own home. Neighbors started gathering around, whispering. Did the HOA really do this? How far were they planning to go? Who sends a fake officer to scare someone? Another police car arrived. Officers began questioning witnesses. The police chief spoke calmly with them, explaining exactly what happened. The HOA had no idea what kind of storm they had created, while the fake officer sat in the back of a patrol car. Handcuffed and shaking, the homeowner stepped down from his porch. He felt a strange mix of relief, anger, and disbelief. A neighbor walked over to him. I saw the HOA board members talking to that man earlier this week, she whispered. They told him something about removing a problem. I didn't understand what they meant, but now it makes sense. Hearing that made the homeowner's heart sink, so it really was planned. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't random. A few minutes later, one officer said, We're going to need statements from everyone. This is serious. The police chief nodded. This won't end here. The HOA crossed a line. The homeowner looked at him and said quietly, All of this. Over what? The police chief replied, Over power. Some people think rules give them the right to control others. But this is beyond anything I've seen from a neighborhood board. As the officers continued their work, the street that usually felt peaceful now buzzed with tension and disbelief. The HOA had completely forgotten that the person they were trying to intimidate wasn't alone. They had picked the wrong house. They had picked the wrong person to threaten, and they had chosen the worst possible day to send a fake officer by the time the sun began to set. Everyone in the neighborhood knew something had happened. People stood in small groups, discussing everything they saw. Police cars came and went. The HOA's attempt to scare one resident had turned into a public disaster. The homeowner stood on his porch, finally breathing a little easier. The fake officer was gone. The situation was under control. But as he watched the police cars drive away and neighbors return to their homes, he knew one thing for sure. This was far from over, because the truth still needed to come out, and the HOA had a lot to answer for in the days that followed. Everything would change, and the neighborhood would never look the same again. The days that followed the heated board meeting did not calm anything down. In fact, the neighborhood felt even more tense. People whispered at mailboxes, glanced over their shoulders when walking dogs, looked out their windows more often than usual. It was clear to everyone that something big was coming, but no one could tell what shape it would take. The air carried a kind of nervous silence, as if the entire street was holding its breath. At the center of it all was the same house the HOA had targeted before, the one they still believed they had some control over. The family inside was tired. They wanted peace more than anything else, yet peace felt like a distant dream. They went on with their daily routines, but their minds stayed alert. They had seen how far the HOA was willing to go, and they were preparing for anything. What they didn't know was that the board members were having secret meetings of their own. They were gathered inside the living room of the HOA president, planning their next move. The blinds were pulled shut, the lights dim, and papers were spread across a large wooden table. Their expressions were tight, almost desperate. They could feel the community slipping from their control. Nothing frightened them more. The president spoke in a sharp voice, trying to hide the frustration underneath. He said they had to make an example, something bold enough to scare the rest of the neighborhood back into silence. A few board members exchanged unsure glances. They knew things were getting out of hand, but fear of losing their position made them go along with the plan. One person suggested involving law enforcement again, but in a way that would not backfire this time. They talked about it as if it were a normal option. Something simple, something already done before. The idea was reckless, but the president leaned into it. He wanted to push the family into a corner, force them into giving up and accepting whatever the HOA said. What none of them realized was that even while they plotted, people were recording them. A neighbor who lived across the street had long suspected something was not right with the board. She had seen too much, heard too much, and kept quiet for too long. She set her phone on the windowsill with the microphone pointed toward the president's house. She captured every word the board members said, including their new plan. The audio was clear, sharp, undeniable. She knew the family needed to hear it. Later that evening, she walked over and knocked on their door. When they opened it, she looked nervous but determined. She told them she had information they needed. She explained what she heard and showed them the recording. As they played it back, their faces shifted from surprise to concern to anger. They couldn't believe how far the board was planning to go. The father of the family listened closely, replaying the most concerning parts. He said they needed to take this to someone who would actually help. Someone who understood the law, someone who wasn't scared of the HOA. The neighbor agreed. And she told them she already had a contact in mind. She mentioned that the police chief in a nearby town had been looking into HOA abuses after hearing similar stories from other communities. He had built a quiet reputation for not tolerating corruption. The family thought about it. And the next morning they made the call. They explained everything. The fake accusations, the board's lies, the dangerous plan they had just recorded. The police chief listened patiently, interrupting only to ask clear questions. When the call ended, he said he would handle it personally. His voice carried a firm confidence, the kind that made people breathe easier. But the HOA didn't know any of this. They kept pushing forward with their plan. They believed they held all the power. They even rehearsed what they would say if anyone questioned them. They believed the house was isolated, that the family had no support. They believed they could scare them into obedience. Days passed and the tension grew. The family remained quiet, careful not to give the board any excuse to escalate things. They trusted that help was coming, but the waiting was still difficult. Every knock on the door made them tense. Every email from the HOA made their stomachs sink. Still, they stayed steady. One afternoon, a new message from the HOA arrived. It accused the family of breaking more rules that didn't even exist. The accusations were bizarre, claiming the house was being rented to strangers, claiming they had built a secret addition without approval, even claiming they were running a business out of their garage. None of it was true. The family knew these claims were meant to set the groundwork for something bigger. Across the street, more neighbors began noticing the strange behavior from the board members. Cars from the HOA president's driveway would leave late at night, meeting quietly with other members. Papers and folders were carried around as if they were preparing for some big legal confrontation. People were beginning to talk openly now, and not in the HOA's favor. At the same time, police chief had begun his own investigation. He asked for documents, requested copies of communications, and had quiet conversations with other residents in the neighborhood. He learned quickly that the HOA had a history of bullying and controlling people. Many residents were too scared to speak up before, but with an outsider asking questions, they felt safer. The chief gathered more than enough evidence to know something serious was happening. A week later, he called the family again and told them he was coming in person. He wanted to see everything for himself. When he arrived, he walked the front yard, inspected the house, and looked at the neighborhood. Everything was clean, peaceful, and normal, nothing like what the HOA was claiming. The chief said he would return soon with a plan, and he meant it. The HOA, however, thought time was running out. They assumed the family was preparing something, so they moved faster. They sent a notice stating that the family had 24 hours to comply with their demands or face legal consequences. They used heavy language and tried to make it sound official, but it only made their desperation more obvious. What they didn't expect was that nearly the entire block was now watching them closely. People shared updates through group chats, sent pictures to each other, and even filmed the board members when they came near the family's house. It was the first time the HOA felt the community turning against them. That night, the board held yet another secret meeting, but this time someone who wasn't supposed to be there overheard everything. A teenager walking home from a friend's house paused by the open window of the president's living room. He heard them talking about bringing officers again and forcing their way in if needed. The conversation was clear enough for him to understand the danger. He immediately messaged his parents and told them what he heard. By the next morning, half the street knew what was coming. The family felt the tension rise even more. They sat in their living room discussing what to do next. They didn't want trouble, and they didn't want anyone to get hurt. They just wanted to live in peace. But peace was not something the HOA was willing to give. The father reminded everyone to stay calm. He said help was near. He trusted the chief's word. Still, uncertainty filled the room. The mother looked worried, staring out the window at every passing car. Their kids sat quietly, sensing the stress even if they didn't fully understand it. That afternoon, just as the sun began to lower, a black SUV slowly rolled into the neighborhood. People peeked from their windows, wondering who it was. Some thought it was the HOA preparing a surprise move. Others thought it was someone coming to confront the board, but it wasn't either of those. It was the police chief. He stepped out calmly, wearing plain clothes, with a folder tucked under his arm. He walked up the street slowly, observing the homes and the people watching him from behind curtains. His footsteps were steady, almost reassuring. When he reached the family's house, he knocked gently. They let him in. He asked them for one more run-through of everything that had happened. They explained again, showed him the messages, played the recordings, and gave him every detail they remembered. He nodded the whole time, taking notes. Then he said it clearly. The HOA was planning something illegal. He told the family to stay inside, lock their doors, and not open for anyone except him. He also said he was calling in a team not to arrest the family, but to watch the HOA. For the first time in weeks, the family felt a spark of hope. Meanwhile, the HOA president received a message from one of the board members saying, "Tonight is our chance." They won't see it coming. They believed they were in control, but they didn't know that every move they made was not to be watched, and they certainly didn't know they had picked the wrong house, the wrong street, and the wrong police chief to challenge. The stage was set. The neighborhood was silent. Everyone felt the storm coming, and the next part of the story would change everything. The night that changed everything began quietly, almost too quietly. The sky was clear, the streetlights glowed softly, and the neighborhood looked calm on the surface. But inside every house, people were awake, alert, and waiting for something they didn't fully understand. They sensed that the long fight between the family and the HOA was reaching a breaking point. Inside the family's living room, the air felt heavy. They had eaten dinner early, but barely touched their food. Everyone sat close, speaking in low voices, trying not to show how worried they were. Even the dog lay silently at their feet, ears pointed toward the windows. Every small sound from outside made them turn their heads. The father kept checking his phone, waiting for updates from the police chief. The mother walked back and forth, glancing through the curtains every few minutes, worried that the HOA might strike before the chief arrived with help. Their children stayed quiet, sensing the seriousness in the room even without understanding all the details. Across the street, neighbors looked out from behind curtains, whispering about the board members who had been acting strangely all day. Someone claimed they saw the HOA president loading documents into his car. Another said the board members had been having heated arguments outside earlier. Everyone felt something big was brewing. Just after 9 in the evening, the first sign came. A dark sedan slowly entered the street and parked near the HOA president's house. Its headlights were turned off early, making the entrance look sneaky. A few minutes later, 2 board members hurried outside and got into the car. They sat for a long moment, talking quietly, as if planning their final move. Inside the family's home, the father saw the car through the window and told everyone to stay calm. He grabbed his phone and texted the police chief, letting him know that something unusual was happening. The message was sent, but there was no immediate reply. Minutes later, another car entered the neighborhood. This time it was a white SUV, one the board had used for official HOA visits before. It parked 2 houses away from the family's home. The engine was left running. The board president got out, looked around nervously, then waved at the sedan. The family's hearts pounded. They knew this wasn't a coincidence. Then the phone buzzed. It was the police chief. "Stay inside. Do not open the door. I'm close." Those words brought a mix of relief and fear. The family backed away from the windows and hugged each other tightly across the neighborhood. Lights flicked on as people noticed the growing activity. A few residents stepped onto their porches, pretending to check mail or take out trash, just to get a better look. The HOA president grew irritated, shouting at a board member to get on with it before anyone interferes. From the living room window, the father watched as the group of board members walked toward their home. They carried folders, clipboards, and something that looked like a printed notice. Their steps were fast, clumsy, and overwhelmed with panic. They pushed each other forward, clearly scared, yet determined to push through with the plan. The mother whispered, "Don't move. Don't say a word." But before the board could even reach the sidewalk in front of the family's yard, another car turned into the street. This one was familiar. It was the black SUV the police chief had used earlier. He pulled in slowly, calmly, almost silently, and parked right behind the HOA's white SUV. The board members froze mid-step. The police chief stepped out, wearing a plain jacket and holding a folder. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked straight toward the group with the kind of confidence that made everyone watching feel instantly safer. "Evening," he said firmly. The HOA president's face drained of color. "We're conducting official HOA business," he stammered. "No," the chief replied with calm certainty. "You're not." His tone was quiet, but it cut through the night like a sharp blade. Neighbors began stepping onto their porches. Some filmed from a distance. Others whispered the news on their phones, telling friends and family that something big was happening. The chief stood in front of the board, looking each of them in the eyes. "You planned to fake enforcement action. You lied about violations. You tried to misuse law enforcement. And you threatened residents. All of that stops tonight." The HOA president tried to defend himself, but his voice shook. "This family is out of compliance." "We have every right. You have no right to fabricate charges," the chief interrupted, still in the same calm tone. "You have no right to harass people in their own homes. And you definitely have no right to impersonate legal authority." He then opened the folder he brought and pulled out a stack of printed documents. "I've reviewed every message you sent, every recorded conversation, every fake notice. I've spoken to your neighbors, and I've spoken to your former board members." One of the board members stepped backward, clearly shaken. Another whispered, "This is not good." The chief continued, "You tried to stage a false incident tonight? That is a serious offense, and you would have succeeded if your community hadn't cared enough to speak up." The president's voice cracked. "We were just trying to keep order." "No," the chief said. "You were trying to keep control. There's a difference." Then he turned slightly toward the family's home. "Stay inside," he said loudly enough for them to hear. "You're safe." The mother placed her hand over her heart. The father wrapped his arm around her. The children peeked from behind the couch. They didn't fully know what was happening, but they felt protected. The chief then addressed the crowd of neighbors. "Thank you for coming forward. This community deserves transparency and fairness." He returned his attention to the board. "Here's what happens next." He laid out each point slowly so they could not misunderstand. "You will step away from any HOA enforcement until an outside review is completed. Second, you will turn over all records, including communication logs, financial documents, and meeting notes. Third, no further contact with this family or any other resident about fabricated violations." The president tried one last desperate attempt. "You can't force us to, actually," the chief said. "I can, and I will." Neighbors murmured in agreement. Someone clapped softly. Someone else said, "About time." The board members stood stiff, unable to argue. They knew they had been caught. Not by the family, not by other residents, but by someone who actually understood the law and wasn't afraid of them. The chief stepped closer and lowered his voice, making it even more intimidating. "If you attempt another fake enforcement action, I'll make sure the consequences are real." The board members swallowed hard. The chief then told them to return to the president's house and wait for a written order that would arrive within the hour. They walked away quietly, their shoulders slumped, confidence gone. As they retreated, neighbors slowly gathered near the family's front yard, keeping a respectful distance but showing support. Some waved. Some offered reassuring smiles. The family, feeling overwhelmed but safe, stepped outside finally. The police chief met them halfway. "You're okay now," he said gently. "This ends tonight." Father thanked him. His voice cracked from weeks of stress. The mother wiped tears from her cheeks. The children stood close to them, watching everything. Neighbors came over with warm words, things like, "You're not alone. We're with you, and they won't get away with this anymore. People who once stayed silent now found their voices. The chief smiled at them. This community has more strength than it realized. Sometimes all it takes is one push for people to stand up. As the night went on, peace slowly returned to the neighborhood. The HOA president stayed inside his home, afraid to show his face. The board group chat went silent. The printed notices that once filled mailboxes suddenly stopped. The family finally slept peacefully for the first time in a long while. Over the next few days, investigators reviewed the HOA's conduct. Residents provided statements. Recordings were handed over. Emails were printed. Everything pointed to a pattern of abuse and intimidation. Weeks later, a formal announcement was made. The entire board was removed from their positions. A temporary leadership group made up of actual reasonable neighbors took their place. They promised transparency, fairness, and better communication. The family received a written apology from the association. Though everyone knew it wasn't truly from the board members, it was from the temporary group trying to rebuild trust. But the family didn't need the apology. They already had something better: peace. The police chief visited them one last time. He told them the case was officially closed and that they had nothing more to worry about. When he left, neighbors waved at him like he was a hero in a way. He was. Months later, the neighborhood looked different. Not in appearance, but in energy. People talked more. They watched out for one another. They made sure no one felt alone. The family often hosted small gatherings. The neighbor who recorded the board's meeting was invited every time. Life went back to normal. A peaceful normal. A well-deserved normal. And whenever the story was mentioned by new residents, by curious visitors, or by neighbors sharing memories, the same sentence always followed: the HOA tried a fake arrest. But they picked the wrong house, and definitely the wrong police chief. It became a reminder of courage, a reminder of unity, a reminder that even the smallest voices matter when they stand together. And above all, it became a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there is always someone willing to do what is right.